You know, in a world that's constantly talking about carbon emissions, the whole idea of a country absorbing more co-eros than it emits, it almost sounds like a fantasy,
It
right?
really does seem quite extraordinary in today's context.
But it's real. And that's what we're diving into today, thanks to the great sources you shared. We're talking about Bhutan,
Hmm.
a nation that isn't just aiming for carbon neutrality, they're actually carbon negative.
That's right.
So our mission here is to really unpack that. How did they achieve it? What's unique about their approach to, keeping the environment front and center?
It's a fascinating case study. And yeah, what immediately jumps out is just the scale of it.
Yeah.
We need to break down first what carbon negative actually means in real numbers,
Okay.
then look at the specific policies, the actions they've taken,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, also the challenges, because it's not without its hurdles.
Right.
And prepare for some pretty surprising figures, especially about their forests.
All right, let's get straight to it then. Carbon negative. What are we actually talking about here? The source material had some solid numbers.
It did, and they paint a very clear picture. So Bhutan puts out roughly 2.2 million tons of carbon dioxide each year, give or take.
Okay, 2.2 million tons emitted.
But here's the thing. Their forests, they're like these incredible sponges. They soak up over 7 million tons of co-euro annually.
7 million,
Yeah.
wow.
So you do the math. That leaves a net negative balance of around 4.8 million tons. They're literally pulling carbon out of the atmosphere.
Okay, so they're acting as a massive carbon sink. That's huge.
It is a natural system absorbing far more than it releases.
How does that absorption rate stack up against, say, other heavily forested countries? But maybe more importantly, how did they get here? This wasn't an accident, surely.
Oh, absolutely not. It's baked into their national philosophy and very specific policy choices. One of the absolute cornerstones is how they protect nature in their constitution.
And the Constitution.
Yes. Bhutan's constitution actually mandates, it requires that a minimum of 60% of the country's land must remain under forest cover.
60% minimum by law. That's incredible.
And they actually exceed that quite comfortably. Right now, it's over 70% forested.
I mean, enshrining forest cover in the Constitution, that's a powerful statement, isn't it? How many nations do that? It just speaks volumes about their priorities right from the top.
It really does. And with over 70% coverage, those forests are obviously doing a massive amount of work, pulling co-euros out of the air, photosynthesis on a national scale.
It's a fundamental commitment. Okay, so the forests are clearly vital, but I know their energy sector is also a big part of the story.
Yeah.
Very green, right? Tell us about the hydropower.
Yeah, that's another absolutely critical piece. Bhutan gets almost all, nearly 100% of its electricity from hydropower.
Harnessing all those rivers and mountains.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is they produce so much clean electricity, they export a large chunk of it,
Yeah.
primarily to India. So they're not just powering themselves cleanly, they're actually helping reduce emissions elsewhere too, regionally.
Right.
And of course, domestically, their electricity use is basically fossil fuel free.
Exporting clean power. It's smart. Are there any, I don't know, dependencies or risks with relying heavily on that export market long term?
That's a fair question. There are always economic factors. But purely from an emissions standpoint, it's a huge win-win. Leverages their natural assets cleanly.
Definitely. Okay, so clean energy, massive forests. What about the rest of the economy? Like industrial activity? That must be lower too.
It is, and that's also quite deliberate. Bhutan hasn't gone down the path of heavy industrialization.
A conscious choice.
Yes, fewer large factories, less industrial pollution, which naturally means lower greenhouse gas emissions overall. And similarly, vehicle numbers are relatively low compared to many places. It keeps transport emissions in check too.
Okay, so it's a development model that intentionally sidesteps high-emission industries. It sounds like sustainability is really woven into their planning. The sources also mention specific environmental laws.
They have a solid legal framework. The National Environment Protection Act is key. It basically ensures development projects consider environmental sustainability.
Right.
And a big part of that is the mandatory environmental impact assessments, EIAs, for any major project.
So you have to prove it won't wreck the environment before you build.
Essentially, yes. You have
Yeah.
to thoroughly assess the potential consequences right from the start. It embeds that thinking early on.
Makes total sense. Now, something that always comes up with Bhutan is this unique idea of gross national happiness, GNH. How does that connect to all this environmental success?
G&H. This is where Bhutan's approach gets really insightful, I think. It's not just some catchy phrase, it's their core development philosophy.
Okay.
And environmental conservation is explicitly one of its four main pillars. It sits alongside things like good governance and socioeconomic development.
So the environment is valued just as highly as economic growth.
Exactly. Policies are judged on whether they improve long-term well-being, not just short-term profit. And a healthy environment is seen as absolutely fundamental to well-being. It changes the whole calculation compared to standard GDP-focused models.
That is a fundamental difference, a much more holistic view. Okay, so we have the Constitution, hydropower, low industrialization, GNH. What are they doing now to stay carbon negative? It must take ongoing effort.
Oh, absolutely. They're very active. Reforestation and conservation are always high on the list. They run huge tree planting campaigns.
Saw a stat on that.
Yeah, the source mentioned one event where they planted over 49,000 trees in just 1 hour.
49,000 in an hour. That's incredible mobilization.
It shows real commitment. Plus, over half, more than 50% of Bhutan's land is officially protected. National parks, reserves, wildlife corridors, locking in those carbon sinks.
Dedicating half the country to protection, that's a serious long-term investment. What about other sectors like agriculture?
That's also part of the picture. They're really pushing sustainable agriculture, more organic farming, community forestry initiatives.
Less reliance on chemicals.
Right. There are restrictions on chemical fertilizers and pesticides. That cuts emissions from manufacturing those chemicals. Plus, it's better for biodiversity, soil health. It all connects.
A move back towards more natural farming. Fits the pattern. And transport, always a tricky one for emissions.
They're tackling that too. The government's encouraging electric vehicles, EVs, using subsidies and support to make them more attractive.
Okay, EV push.
And they're also investing in public transport, trying to reduce the need for everyone to have a private, petrol or diesel car. Standard stuff, but important.
Important pieces, definitely. Now, Bhutan's tourism model is famously different. High value, low volume, right?
Yeah.
How does that impact their carbon status?
It's quite clever, actually. By focusing on high-value, low-volume, they limit the sheer number of tourists arriving.
Fewer flights, less infrastructure strain.
Exactly. Less environmental footprint from tourism. And crucially, tourists pay a sustainable development fee, an SDF.
Ah, yes, the SDF.
And that money goes directly towards funding environmental conservation, social programs, maintaining culture. It makes tourism actively contribute to their sustainability goals.
So tourism pays its way, environmentally speaking. That's smart. It sounds like this isn't just top-down policy, though. Is the community involved?
Hugely involved. Community engagement is vital. Environmental education is part of the school curriculum, so it starts young.
Building awareness early.
And you see communities actively participating in things like managing waste, cleaning up areas, planting trees. It's a shared responsibility.
So it's embedded in the culture, not just enforced by law. That makes a huge difference. I also saw something about carbon credits. How does that work if they're already negative?
Well, because they absorb so much more carbon than they emit, they technically generate surplus carbon credits under some international frameworks. They can potentially sell or trade these credits on the international market. The revenue earned can then be plowed back into more green projects within Bhutan.
Ah, I see. So their good environmental performance can actually generate funds for more good performance. A positive feedback loop.
Precisely. It turns environmental stewardship into a potential revenue stream for further sustainable development.
This whole picture is quite remarkable. And Bhutan has received a lot of international praise for this, haven't they?
Oh, definitely. They're widely seen as a global leader in conservation. They're active participants in global climate talks, like the COP conferences.
Sharing their model.
Yes, and their voice carries weight because, well, they're actually doing it. They have proof of concept.
A small nation leading by example. It's very inspiring. But the sources did mention challenges remain. It's not all smooth sailing, is it?
No, definitely not. They're on the front lines of climate change impacts, ironically. Glacier melt in the Himalayas is a huge concern.
Leading to floods.
Potentially, yes. Glacial lake outburst floods are a real risk, and it affects water security, too. And then there's the pressure of development. As the economy grows, urbanization increases.
Yeah.
There's always a risk that emissions could creep up.
So they have to actively manage growth to keep it green.
Exactly. They're working on climate adaptation strategies, focusing on eco-friendly urban planning, trying to stay ahead of the curve and maintain that negative status even as they develop.
So vigilant even in success. There was that great quote included from the former Prime Minister, Tshering Tobgay, really summed up their philosophy.
Yes, that quote is very powerful. He said basically, we are doing this not because we are carbon negative, but because we believe it is our responsibility to care for the Earth.
Hmm.
It highlights that this isn't just about hitting a target. It's rooted in a deeper ethical and cultural value system, responsibility, stewardship.
Mm.
That's the core driver.
That really puts it perfectly, doesn't it? It's about responsibility, not just statistics. So, wrapping up this depth dive, what's the big takeaway here? What should we remember about Bhutan's story?
I think the main thing is that being carbon negative wasn't an accident for Bhutan. It was the result of very deliberate, long-term choices
Hmm.
woven into their constitution, their energy policy, their whole development philosophy,
Right.
that G&H idea and a strong cultural value placed on the environment.
Right. Policy meets culture, meets geography.
Exactly. It shows that a different path, one that truly prioritizes sustainability and well-being, is actually possible. It's not just theoretical.
It certainly is proof of concept. And it really makes you think, looking at all the things Bhutan does, which elements feel like they could maybe be adapted or inspire action elsewhere, given, all the different global contexts and challenges?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But things like legally mandating environmental protection, truly integrating well-being beyond just GDP, investing seriously in renewables, maybe that tourism model,
Hmm.
and definitely fostering that community buy-in. These offer lessons, even if they need adapting.
Absolutely. Lots to learn there. Which brings us to a final thought for everyone listening. If we take Bhutan's focus on long-term well-being through environmental care seriously, what might a truly carbon negative world actually look like? And what fundamental shifts in our priorities globally would we need to even begin to get there? Something to ponder on the deep connection between policy, values, and the planet.